Hey class, welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. I hope everyone's doing well today. In today's video lecture, we're going to be looking at the ethics at the beginning of life, and we're going to be looking at part 1, but it's video number 2. We're just going to have a continuation of what we were looking at last time. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. At the beginning of life, part 1. Now this is the second lecture for this week. Remember there was the previous PowerPoint was the same title, part 1, but I broke part 1 into 2 sections. So this is the second section for part 1. Just a quick review there on the screen. Last time we talked about abortion with the legal background and the different cases that we looked at. We looked at the biblical data for the personhood of the conceived fetus, and then we looked at the pro-choice arguments for abortion with the pro-life response, or with the problems with the pro-choice argument. We looked at that last time in the last lecture. And today we're going to be looking at the decisive moments and some reasoning that is given there. And it's basically the personhood of the fetus. And there's different views on when a fetus becomes a person. And then we're going to move into stem cell research, which is a controversial thing, especially when it comes to using aborted tissue or aborted parts of the aborted fetus. And then the medical breakthroughs, sources, and problems with that. So we'll be looking at that lower section today there on the PowerPoint, the lower section. Okay, so decisive moments, the personhood of the fetus. Most philosophers agree that the fetus either has personhood at conception or it acquires it at some point in the gestation process. So there's agreement across the board that the personhood is either at conception or the fetus gets its personhood at some time while it's still in the womb before birth. And these are called decisive moments. There you see the second bullet point, a variety of decisive moments at which the fetus becomes a person. Okay, so that's the definition for decisive moments for our study. And they've been proposed, and there's different ones. We're going to look through some of them and basically the problems for them, because really as you look in the scripture, basically the fertilized egg at conception is a person, as we looked at last time. But we're going to look at these other decisive moments that are out there. None of the different decisive moments suggest any relevant change in the essence of the fetus, and that's the thing. There's no change in what the fetus is in regards to its personhood or the essence of the fetus. It's just along different stages of development within the womb. On the contrary, there is a constant process of growth and development from conception all the way to adulthood, and we see that just in natural life. From conception, there's progress as the fetus grows within the mother and in the womb, and just continues to grow all the way till its birth. And then the child grows from a baby or an infant to a baby to a toddler to a child to a preteen to a teenager to adult, and continuing growth in adulthood. So there's always a process of growth for the human all the way from conception. Okay, so let's look at these decisive moments. Decisive moment number 1, viability. This view is that the fetus becomes a person when it can survive outside of the womb, and some people hold to this. When a fetus can be born and early and survive outside the womb, then it's a person. The problem with that is medical technology is always changing and has pushed survival of infants born to earlier and earlier stages. And so if it's like 25, 26 weeks and the baby can survive outside the womb at that time, some people hold that to being that's when it becomes a person. But in history, it wasn't always 25 weeks. It might have been 30 weeks. Medical technology allows us to keep pushing that back. And then another point is first world countries like the United States or some in Europe or whatever, they have medical facilities that can aid in early survival. We have the technology, we have the equipment, we have the hospitals. And so yes, a baby born at 25 weeks or 26 weeks, they can survive in the medical facility, in the incubator or whatever in the hospital. But not in third world countries. So if you have a third world country that doesn't have that medical technology and that baby doesn't survive at 25 weeks, then is there a difference in personhood? So that's the problems that go against this decisive moment of viability. So but that is a view, viability. Number 2, brain development. This decisive moment basically says personhood is established at the time that the brain begins to function. And that's around 45 days in the womb. There begins to be brain activity of the fetus. And this is a very popular view because what it does, it compares this brain development where the brain begins to function in the fetus to the death of a person when brain activity stops. So, you can definitely see when a person dies that their brain activity has stopped. And so proponents of brain development decisive moments, they go and push that back to the fetus, and when the brain activity starts, that's when it becomes a person. The problem with that is, unlike the dead brain of the dead person, which is permanent, the developing brain of a fetus before 45 days is just temporary. From conception, the fetus has the capacity for brain activity. So even though, let's say at day 35, there's no brain activity, well, that's just temporarily it's just temporarily there's no brain activity because the brain is still developing. What is developing there has the capacity for brain activity at day 45, around there, around that time period. So you can't just say, well, looking at the dead person, though, because that's a permanent death. But the lack of brain activity in the fetus before day 45 is just because the brain hasn't developed yet to be able to function. But it will get to that point. In the majority of pregnancies, it will get to that point where the brain will then start functioning at day 45. So this decisive moment doesn't really hold, but it is a popular view. Decisive moment number 3 is sentience, and sentience is when the personhood is given to the fetus when the fetus can feel pain, and this is a popular moment, sentience, with pro-choice advocates, so those that are for abortion, because it removes cruelty from the abortion. So if you can abort before the fetus even feels pain, then it's not that big of a deal. And if it can feel pain, well, that's when it becomes a person. That's what an abortion advocate would say. The problem with this is that the ability to feel or not feel pain has no bearing on personhood. Okay, it's not even in the same ballpark to the attributes of personhood. If this reasoning is followed, a person who is unconscious or put to sleep for surgery, or even for some just deeply sleeping, where there's pain that occurs to them and they just don't know it, would they cease to be a person? And obviously the answer is no. So if you go in for heart surgery and they put you to sleep for 8 hours on the operating table because it's a long surgery, for those 8 hours, you're not feeling any pain and they're cutting you open. Well, just because you don't feel pain, you don't stop being a person while you're on that operating table. But that's the same reasoning. It's just because the fetus doesn't feel pain at a certain point in the pregnancy has no bearing on it being a person or not. And again, you have to remember back that the pro-choice advocates, the abortion advocates, they have to prove that the fetus is not a person, and they can't do that. It's always just assumed that the fetus is not a person. Okay, so that's number 3, sentience. Number 4, decisive moment, is birth. Okay, some people hold that when the baby comes out of the womb at its birth, when the baby is delivered, then it becomes a person. Now, the problem with this is this has no bearing on personhood whatsoever. In fact, this isn't even really that popular of a view. It's just because the fact is there is no change in the fetus itself before it is delivered or after it is delivered. So, as is highlighted in yellow there, the only difference is the location of the fetus. The proponent for the birth decisive moment, while the baby's in the womb in the morning, it's not a person. But then the mother gives birth, and at 3 in the afternoon, all of a sudden this fetus becomes a person. Well, no, all it did was change location in the same day. So it's not. It doesn't hold up at all. But some people do believe that birth is a decisive moment. Okay, number 5, decisive moment number 5 is implantation. This is when the fetus becomes a person, when the fertilized egg implants in the uterus. And this is a very popular view because there's no signal yet of a pregnancy. That fertilized egg needs to implant in the uterus to signal through hormones being sent out to signal in the mother's brain that she's pregnant, and then the hormones will be produced to where the pregnancy test can show that she's pregnant. Also, many fertilized eggs miscarry before any implantation even occurs. So therefore, based on that reasoning, this is a very critical step in the pregnancy process, but it still has problems. Here's the problems. The unawareness of pregnancy by the mother, again, has no bearing on the personhood. Just because she doesn't know she's pregnant doesn't mean that it's not a person. The implantation is essential for survival of the fertilized egg, not its personhood. Okay, so implantation, obviously, you can't have a pregnancy without the implantation. But implantation is essential for the survival of the egg. It has no bearing establishment of its personhood. And then the last bullet point there under problem is just an example or a comparison. Food and water are essential for human survival. Just like implantation is essential for survival of the fertilized egg, food and water are essential for human survival, but it has no bearing on the personhood of the human that needs the food and the water. So if you're starving and dying of thirst out in the desert somewhere, and you need that for your survival, that has no bearing on your personhood. It's just that you need those things for your survival. Well, it's the same thing within the fertilized egg that is not implanted yet. Implantation is essential for its survival, but it has no bearing on the personhood of the fertilized egg. So highlighted in green, real bold there, none of the above decisive moments, numbers 1 through 5 we just looked at, none of them are persuasive. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have an argument here for personhood at conception. Personhood at conception. And here's 3 reasons for our argument. Number 1, an adult human being is the end result of the continuous growth of the organism from conception. Okay, so that conception has to take place for the egg to even be able to be fertilized, to where it can go and implant in the uterus and then continue to grow in the womb and all of that. So it's the end result of continuous growth. Number 2, from conception to adulthood, this development has no break that is relevant to the essential nature of the fetus. So it's from conception to adulthood, there is continuous growth for the person all the way from conception. Number 3, therefore, one is a human person from the point of conception onward. And as with a biblical worldview, as a Christian, we're obviously going to go then to the Scripture, and we are going to see, as we did in last PowerPoint, just the different passages of Scripture that talk about God knowing us before before we were born. Okay, so conceding the person. Now this is just an interesting little section we have to look at here, because some people have in the past, they have come up with these ideas that really kind of backfires on them, and what they end up doing is they actually concede that the fetus is a person. You see there on the screen, Judith Jarvis Thompson, she said that there is no moral obligation for the mother to support the life of the unborn. And so what she did was she came up with this analogy that she used to basically say that the mother is being held hostage by the baby or the fetus, and so that she really has no moral obligation to even keep that fetus alive anymore. So on page 149 to 150, she actually says this analogy, and this is the analogy she gives. So the book says, philosopher Judith Jarvis Thompson, in which she compares a woman with an unwanted pregnancy to a person who has been kidnapped in order to provide a life-saving blood transfusion to a world-renowned violinist. The violinist is dying, and the person providing the transfusion is essential to the violinist being able to continue living. even though the violinist will die if the person unplugs from the transfusion. Thomas argues that there is no moral obligation for the kidnapped person to continue to provide this life-saving service. Then she then argues that the woman with an unwanted pregnancy has essentially been kidnapped by the fetus and forced to provide life-saving service by continuing the pregnancy. She concludes that the pregnant woman has no obligation to save the fetus's life and is morally justified in ending the pregnancy, even though it would result in the death of the fetus. So the argument against that is that the fetus does not kidnap the body. It's just ludicrous to even think that the fetus has kidnapped the body. Also, unlike the story where a stranger is kidnapped to keep some violinist alive, the fetus is not a stranger. I mean, the fetus is half of the mother. The mother gives half of her DNA through her egg, and then the other half comes from the father. So it's definitely not a stranger. And then pregnant women are not usually cloistered or kept away like a kidnapped woman with a violinist. Pregnant women are not usually cloistered and kept away and held hostage, by some fetus. A change of location does not change the obligation. Okay, so for example, a 1-year-old cannot survive without the mother and has a claim to her. So, if a 1-year-old needs the mother for survival, to be able to eat and be changed and being taken care of and all of that, does that mean the 1-year-old is holding the mother hostage? And if that's the case, then you could actually argue for infanticide. That the 1-year-old needs to be get rid of the 1-year-old because the mother's held hostage by the 1-year-old. So none of this. All of what Judith Jarvis Thompson is saying, none of it really holds any weight whatsoever. But what is important to understand with this is that she's conceding that the fetus is a person because she compares the fetus to a violinist. So in her little analogy there, they would both be persons. Another one is Hilda Lindemann calling the fetus into personhood. And this is in our textbook on page 152. Okay, and so what she says is she describes personhood as a social practice. What the pregnant woman does is, quote, call the fetus into personhood by making physical arrangements for it, creating social space for it within her family and the wider community, and in an imaginative projection, conceiving of it as if it were already the born child she hopes it will become. She takes an attitude towards them of the kind reserved for persons. Okay, so this is what Hilda Lindemann said, and again, it's the mother creating this home for the fetus once it's born, for the child. She's creating this home as if it's a person, because inside the womb it is a person. So really, it's just a complete. What she says is basically a recognition of personhood. And it's not its determination. It doesn't come to where the home she makes is the determination of it being a person or not. It's just a recognition already that the fetus is a person. So even in some of their own arguments, it comes out that they're conceding that the fetus is a person. Okay, but like I said, that can bring up another kind of sticky situation, infanticide. And you might think of this and be like, that is taboo in the United States. And yes, it is. It's not practiced in the United States. It's against the law. Once the baby is born, it must be taken care of and all of that. But it does occur around the world. And infanticide, it's happened in history, and it still continues to today. But infanticide, proponents use the same argument as the pro-life opponents of late-term or partial birth abortions, just in an opposite way. Pro-life advocates are their opponents to the late-term or partial birth abortions. But the people that are proponents for infanticide, they use the same argument, but just in an opposite way. So here's their argument. The pro-life, the change of location from inside the womb to the outside has no bearing on the personhood. Okay, so that's the pro-life position. It just from the womb, it comes out of the womb. It was a person in both places. The pro-choice says the change of location from inside the womb to the outside has no bearing on the personhood. It's the exact same argument, but just used in an opposite way. They're saying that if it has no bearing on personhood, well, then it's not a person inside the womb, and therefore it's not a person outside of the womb. And then sometime in the future, it would become a person, whether that be through the parent wanting it, or there's a desire to raise the child, or something like that, and then it's welcomed into the home. Then it becomes a person. So they're using the same argument, it's just in an opposite way. That's why it says on the bottom it's a double-edged premise. Okay, so just be aware of that. Infanticide is not common in the United States, and if it did occur in the United States, it's illegal. There are things that you might hear in the news where, a mother gives birth to the baby and throws the baby who's alive into a dumpster, in a trash can, leaves the in the bathroom somewhere, for just the baby just to die. That's considered an infanticide. Okay, let's move on. Fetal tissue and stem cells. In 1993, the U.S. Department of Health Services published guidelines allowing the use of fetal tissue in research if the mother, number 1, consents, number 2, does not have compensation, and number 3, has no knowledge of the recipient of the tissue. The facilities, except those within 6 states, which store this material for research, they can be compensated. Okay, so this is what was put into place, that they could use aborted fetal tissue for research. Well, there's obviously opposition to this. Opponents of fetal tissue research argue that, number 1, so here's their argument, number 1, abortions are not natural or accidental deaths like an organ harvesting, but they're intentional. So, a person that's opposed to abortion, they're going to say that the abortion is killing a person. And so it was not an accidental death or a natural death, such as through a miscarriage, but it was an actual intentional death when the abortionist performed the abortion. And that's what those that are for fetal tissue research, they basically say it's kind of like organ harvesting, or like they take the organ from an organ donor who had died. They harvest the organs from the dead body to be able to give to other people to use. And they kind of equate it to that. Well, those that are opposed to fetal tissue research say, well, it's not because of a natural death or an accident death, but it was an actual intentional death. Number 2, valid consent is impossible. What this means is that it's not just the consent of the mother that is important here. The valid consent is impossible because the fetus is the one that's the donor, not the mother. The mother's not donating her tissue. The mother is aborting the fetus, and then the actual donor is the fetus. And obviously, a fetus cannot consent to any kind of donation, being the donor. And also, as we've been talking for so long now, the fetus is aborted. The fetus is killed. So so valid consent is not even possible. Number 3, restrictions on the purchase and sale of fetal tissue has not diminished a thriving market. And then number 4, salvaging fetal tissue hinders making abortion rare because it redeems the abortion. So again, opponents to abortion, the pro-life group, are saying we need to make abortion more rare. And when people say, well, what we can do is we can have abortions and salvage the fetal tissues, that can be used for good. Well, then what happens is it gives this idea that abortions are okay. It kind of redeems the abortion. Okay, so these are the arguments used by pro-life groups that fetal tissue should not, that comes from abortions, should not be used for research. Okay, so let's look at embryonic stem cell research. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells that can be directed in the lab to develop into over 200 types of cells in the body. So they use these cells to be able to help those that may have some kind of a disease, some kind of an injury, whether it be Parkinson's or MS, to maybe paralyzation or other things that they research, and they're trying to find cures for these diseases. Well, these cells can be directed a certain way to be able to grow into cells that would be good to help cure a disease, let's say. Well, on the screen, there's 3 types of cells. There's pluripotent, which basically is a cell that can become any cell within the body. There's totipotent, which can be an organism in the body. Multipotent is limited in how they can be directed. Okay, so the sources of stem cells are adult stem cells and embryonic stem cells. No problem with the adult stem cells because they can gather adult stem cells through different ways, whether it be through bone marrow or whatever. They can, and the adult give consent to give the stem cells, but the embryonic stem cells, they only come, basically in this context we're talking about here, come through abortion. Embryonic stem cells. The embryo is destroyed in cultivation of the stem cells. Only embryonic stem cells are pluripotent. Okay, so that's the one we talked about in the previous slide. The possibilities of stem cell research is enormous and anticipated to provide the treatments for a tremendous amount of illnesses. That's why there's a lot of money put into this research to try to help with a lot of these different illnesses. But the problem is it destroys the embryo. And so the last bullet point, the underlined one, if personhood begins at conception, the embryonic stem cell research results in the destruction of the fetus. Then embryonic stem cell research should be banned on the grounds that destruction of a fetus is the destruction of a person. So that underlined portion there on the screen is the reasoning that mostly pro-life advocates are going to hold to, because what you're doing is you're not just destroying a clump of tissue or something like that to get these stem cells. No, you're actually destroying the fetus, and if you destroy the fetus, you have now just destroyed a person, which is equal to killing a person. Okay, so that is it for Chapter 5, Ethics at the Beginning of Life, Part 1. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's it for today. And in our next video lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the ethics at the beginning of life, but it's going to be Part 2. I'll see you then.